While you can include multiple lines of R code in line with the Markdown in Rmarkdown, it's generally not a good idea because it makes the Rmarkdown pretty hard to read. If you need to have the output of more than one line of R code work its way back into the Markdown, then it's better to use what's called a code chunk than inline R code. And a code chunk is specified similar to inline R code in that you use a backwards apostrophe, but in this case you use 3 of them. Then after the 3 backwards apostrophes, you put an R in curly brackets. And then you terminate your multiple lines of R code with 3 more backwards apostrophes. You can tell that RStudio knows what a code chunk is because not only does it shade it a different color, showing me where the chunk begins and where the chunk ends, but it also adds some buttons here that lets me do stuff with this chunk. And that can become useful when you're trying to troubleshoot what a given R Markdown file is doing when you're trying to render it. So in this case, it's a similar idea. I've got a chunk of R code that's defined by these backwards apostrophes. And any code that I put in this chunk is going to get run by Rmarkdown. Whatever text is returned by that code is going to get put back into the Markdown in place of the chunk. So all of this from the beginning of the backwards apostrophes to the ends is going to get replaced with whatever is generated by the R code. Now in the case of the R chunk, you have a lot more control over how that works. But let's talk about the different ways that you might want to alter how R code gets run and how material gets put back into the Markdown. So first of all, what I want to do is have this R code generate some text that I send to output that ends up back into the Markdown. And a function I can use for that is the cat function. If I could do a help on cat, you see cat is output objects concatenating the representation. So cat comes from concatenation. And basically, I can just put in a whole bunch of arguments of things that I want to send to the output. Now let's talk a little bit about the differences between cat and print. We've mentioned print before. If I print a vector of values, say between 1 and 5, what that does is print it out as an R data object, in this case a numerical vector, and it wants to tell me it's a vector, which is why it's putting this 1 in closed brackets in front of it. And then it's putting some formatting here that tells me a little bit more about the data structure of this thing, specified by a 1:5, which is a vector of integers going from 1 to 5. So that's good for if I'm coding at the console, but let's just say I want the numbers 1 to 5 to go into my output without this extra square bracket thing that has something to do with the R data object. All I want to do is send the 1 to 5. Well, that's where the cat function comes in. If I do a cat 1:5, now it's no longer an R object, it's just sending the contents of the R object to the output. In this case, numbers separated by spaces going from 1 to 5. So that's why it's really common to use the cat function in chunks if you want to send something from R code back into the Markdown in place of the R chunk. Now in this case, I'm going to add multiple lines of stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and break out this this call to the cat function into several different lines. And similar to before, I want to do something similar to this. So I'm actually going to copy and paste this, but I'm going to rearrange it because of the way that I'm calling it in the chunk. So I'm just going to throw it in here. Okay, let me get indented here. Okay. So the cat is called concatenate because it automatically put things together, similar to the paste function, if you've ever used the paste function before. So I am just going to list several things, strings in this case, that I want to send into the Markdown from inside this chunk. So first of all, this is all just a character string. This report was rendered by Rmarkdown on and an asterisk at the end. Again, these asterisks are to indicate I want italics. So I want all that same stuff, but I need to put it in quotes because in this case, I'm dealing with it in R code. and I want to treat it as a character string, so I need to put quotes around it so that the R code knows that it's a character string. Also, I can actually get rid of this asterisk because I'm just going to put an asterisk at the beginning and the end of the string. I don't need to do this. I only had to put an asterisk here because I was breaking this across multiple lines as markdown. But here I'm doing it in R code, so I can just put an asterisk at the beginning and the very end, and I don't need all the asterisks in the middle. So I've got this character string. Now I want to put in this format. I don't need this backwards apostrophe R anymore because I'm just going to put this format POSIX CT system format. And I'm going to concatenate this string with whatever comes back from the code format.posixct system with all those format commands. And if you remember, I can copy and paste this in the console. What comes back from this code is this string. So I'm basically concatenating this string with whatever the current time string is based on this call to this R code. And finally, if I want to put a period with an asterisk at the end, then I will need to put in quotes a period with an asterisk. Again, this asterisk is just the other side of this asterisk so that this entire string, when it's all put together, will go back into Markdown and be then interpreted as italics for all of this text. There's one other argument to cat that you should know about, that you should be careful with, is the sep argument. You see there's the sep, and by default, the step is a single space. And what the sep tells you is what does it insert in between whatever it's concatenating together. So right now, I've already got a space here, but if I use sep space, it's going to add another space. And at the end here, it's going to add a space between whatever this string is and whatever this string is. Now, that may not matter because extra spaces tend not to matter in Markdown, but just to make sure it's doing exactly what I want, sometimes I will set the separator to no character, which means it's going to insert nothing in between the concatenations. And that way I know I'm just going to have one space here between this text and whatever comes back for the time. And there's going to be no space between the time and this period. Okay, so now if I've done this right, I'm going to go ahead and put an extra space there, an extra line feed. I should have something that looks exactly the same as this. I've just done a different way. I've done it with a code chunk. It's going to take whatever is returned by cat, and it's going to put that back into the markdown. So if I save this and I run it, now I can look at my processing notes HTML that was just regenerated. Well, I can see that I didn't quite get what I thought I did, was going to. Yes, it's taking stuff out and it's putting back into the markdown, but not in the format that I thought it was going to. It certainly doesn't look like this that's done by my inline code. So that's actually expected, and that's because I have not told Rmarkdown how to deal with a chunk in terms of how to take the code and whatever the code generates and put it back into the markdown. So this is what it's going to do by default. If you don't change any of the options on the chunk, then this is what you're going to get. The first thing that's going to happen is it's going to echo the code. That means it's going to show the actual code that's in the chunk in the report. So you can see here's my cat statement, and it's formatted in this gray box so I can tell it's code. This is really useful if the reason you're using Rmarkdown is to instruct people on how your code works or specifically what your code is doing. But sometimes you don't want that. Sometimes you're just trying to automate what goes into the report and you don't want the code that's doing that automation to show up. Also, you can see that it's putting this text in the output as if it were in the R console. These two little pound signs are to indicate that this is what it will look like if you run this code in the R console, what you will see in the R console. And that's not really what we want. We don't want what you would see in the R console. We just want the raw text going back into the Markdown. Because ultimately, if we put this text right here back into the Markdown as it is, without any changes or reformatting, the Markdown then should interpret this as italicized text that we see up here. So that means there's some differences with chunks from inline code in that you have a lot more control in telling a chunk exactly how the R code, or what comes back from the R code, goes back into the Markdown. The way you can control those options in two different ways. You can add these options here. In the first option, by default, echo is true. And that is why the code that's in the chunk gets echoed back to the report. So if I want echo to be false, I need to specify the chunk option that echo is false. And one place to specify chunk options is in a list of key value pairs after the R specified by an equal sign. So I set the argument, the chunk option echo to false. Also, if I want the results to just be the raw text that's spit out by cat, the cat function, then I want to specify the results argument, or the results chunk option should be as is. And again, that's a character string telling it as is. Don't change anything about the text. So this is one way to change chunk options. I'm telling it not to echo the code and to treat the results as it is without changing the formatting. If I rerun this and I refresh, now I have two things that are identical. I can either do it with inline code or do the exact same thing with a chunk, as long as I'm careful with how the chunk options are set up. Now there's one other way to set chunk options, and actually my preferred way to set chunk options. And that's to do it in the chunk itself. There are special comment characters in R with a pound sign for a comment and then a pipe character, or that upwards line character, or that vertical line character. And you can set the chunk options as if they were key value pairs in YAML, like this. So I want to set the echo chunk option to false, and I want to set the results chunk option to as is. Now this should do the exact same thing. The reason I like to do it this way is, again, it keeps my code narrow. Sometimes I have a lot of different options and it goes out past the end of this line. If you have a lot of really long options, I find this much easier to read. So again, I'm setting the echo chunk option to false. I'm setting the results chunk option to as is. I can rerun this just to confirm. That I'm getting the same results. So that's just a couple of ways that you can embed R code into Rmarkdown, and it shows you the different behaviors of what happens when the output from the R code gets put back into the Markdown, and specifically with chunks, how you have some control over how that's done.